Welcome to 10 Minutes for Democracy, this week's stream. Every week I stream about the current events and talk to everybody about what's going on with them, see what people come through. I should have set this to comments, but I didn't, so I'm gonna switch it back over to comments. And I generally start off by talking about kind of my channel because it takes a while for people to come in. I don't have some flurry of people that come in the moment I go live, and I'm not being great about when I start. So I probably on my channel banner will just do something like Thursday evenings for now, because I'm aiming for 6 o'clock, but technical issues come up, all kind of different things happen, and this is actually the latest time that I've started. So still got to working on that. Now, one thing I'm gonna start doing this week is gonna become a channel update. So I have a new video that premiered a few days ago, and for that video I looked at where the different Supreme Court justices seem to stand when it comes to Roe v. Wade. And I'm kind of trying to figure out, so what I'm trying to do for my videos, my weekly streams, I kind of talk about current events and all those things like that. And that's why I have a whole agenda. I'm gonna talk about George Floyd this week, about Biden's new infrastructure plan, about a bunch of different things. But what I still need to do though is try to create evergreen content, things that people are searching on an ongoing basis. I thought Roe v. Wade and its prospects, considering how we now have a 6-3 conservative court, seemed like a good place to start. And it was interesting. I studied 2 of the more recent abortion-related cases, and what I found was, surprisingly, the court, it isn't as clear to me as I might have thought that the court would overturn Roe. I think there are a few votes for that, but I think there are some votes, some members of the court that may want to only do a more nuanced curtailing of a woman's reproductive rights. And so that's an interesting video. It's a little long, but I put chapters in it. Anything over about 6 or 7 minutes, I try to put chapters in. And so I did that for that video, and I'm hoping that people can kind of check into that. They can hop to the end, get the conclusion if that's all they want, or they can go in and see the kind of deep dives into those various cases. And as a kind of insider note, the one thing that I actually was able to rank for with that video, looks like, was the more recent case, which was like June Medical Services versus Russo, I think was the name of that particular case. So we'll see how kind of that goes. But I'll put that out there. It's gotten some views, and hopefully people will appreciate it, and maybe a few of them will subscribe. So I think I'm trying to wait and get a few people in here, but I'm not inclined. I do have at least one viewer, so I'm inclined to go ahead and move forward and start talking about some of the news stories. So just so you see, I'm looking over this way. This is how I control my agenda. I have a screen behind the camera that has my information on what I'm talking about. And so I page that with this control, and then I look over here for comments. If you hopped in, you want to say hello, I say hello back. You want to have any questions you want to ask me, feel free to do so. This is different. This is my first week not wearing a full suit because it gets hot under these lights. I got to keep this well lit. Got to keep the screen behind me well lit so that it says 10 Minutes for Democracy and it's green or fuzzy and looks weird and distracts people. So I decided to try something else. However, I've had this shirt for a while. It's a little big on me. It's been sitting in my closet for a while, so it's got kind of those closet wrinkles you get from just having something sit in your closet for a long time. It might come out of the wash and the dryer, really smooth and crisp looking, but after time it just kind of crinkles up a little bit there. So that's what I kind of got going on here. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today was something that just happened earlier today, which was a mass shooting that took place in Orange, California. Apparently, this individual, a 44-year-old man by the name of Aminadab Gonzalez, walked into, I think it was some kind of store, I'm sure it was a bank or some kind of place of commerce, and just had a handgun and just started shooting the place up. And he killed 4 people, including, unfortunately, a 9-year-old child. The mother was trying to protect and shield her child and actually got wounded, but seems to have survived. Now, this guy is in custody now, which is why I'm comfortable kind of saying his name, because he's not just some guy that's wanted or whatever. They actually apprehended him. He's wounded too. So it's fairly likely that he's the person of interest that committed this crime. Although what I always like to say about news stories is the first few days you hear about them, take everything with a grain of salt. And another case I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, kind of feel the same way about. You have to be careful about taking the first word from news stations about everything, because oftentimes those things aren't the case. So even what I'm telling you now, take with a grain of salt. Things could be misunderstood. We could find out in a week or two that what we know about it isn't right. But unfortunately, it was clearly a mass shooting. 4 people have died, including a child. And it's a sad day. And, you know, there's not a lot we can do about the fact that there's a gun for every man, woman, and child in this country. We've had very lax gun laws for a long time. The Congress even let the what's the name of that law? The assault weapons ban expire over a decade ago. And so we've just got our country just a flood with handguns, machine guns. So I don't know that we can put that genie back in a bottle, but I kind of wish we could. And I am for like buyback programs, anything to lower that number. But the thing about it is oftentimes with these shooters, they're not getting the gun from a friend that already had one or some gun that's 20 years old. They often go, I think the last mass shooting a few days ago, fortunately it was not that long ago. That last mass shooting, the person I think went to a Walmart and bought one. So I do think there's still a value in putting better gatekeeping on who's able to actually purchase new weapons, because over time, old weapons go into disrepair, they get lost, they get thrown away. So that number, we could see that number go down if we really had the wherewithal to, put more restrictions on access based on a person, not being a criminal or really doing good background checks without loopholes. And there's laws, I talked about them last week in that week's stream, which you can still find on Facebook or YouTube, that talks a bit more about that issue and about those laws that passed. But there certainly is some things. Now, one thing I think I didn't mention last week, or not in detail, was the idea of having guns put signatures on every bullet they fire that identify like the maker of the weapon, where the weapon was bought, and just give every gun a unique identifier when it's fired. Now, I'm sure there are probably going to be ways that they could override that, criminals could. And so we'd have to do it in such a way that we really felt like it would be effective. Otherwise, what's the point? If criminals can override it, then there's no point in really doing it. But I do think we need to figure something out, because this is just insane. I mean, we can't have these just mass shootings every few days. And I do think that the fact that there's tons of weapons just floating around in our society has something to do with that. I mean, this is, again, like I said last week, personal responsibility doesn't get us, but so far with situations like this, like all that does is give us the kind of agenda to punish people with. I have no problem holding this Gonzalez guy accountable if he's indeed guilty of this crime, but that doesn't bring those people back to life. It doesn't bring that child back to life. We have to try to put our heads together and come up with an actual solution that helps prevent this from happening in the future. And I think that trying to have a better way of controlling who gets access to guns has something to do with that, because they're very dangerous. We don't let people run around with grenades or bazookas or all kinds of ridiculous weapons of war, but yet even with this guy only seemingly had a handgun, although it was a semi-auto. And those guns are already lethal enough, and I don't know that we can do a whole lot about that. But imagine if this guy got in his hands on an AR-15, how many people might have died. I mean, it makes a difference what weapons we do and don't allow people to buy on a consumer basis. So I think that's something we need to consider and weigh the cost of in terms of our society. Because yes, the Second Amendment grants a certain level of freedom to possess firearms, but to what degree that is really debatable. And of course, the founding fathers had no idea that muskets would one day be able to fire multiple rounds per second, or in hundreds of rounds a minute. That's inconceivable to someone in 1770 or 1789 or 91, whenever the Second Amendment was actually ratified. So we have to bear that in mind. As our society changes, the idea is for our laws and even a founding document like the Constitution to be adjusted. I mean, every generation we modify the Constitution throughout our history. It doesn't stay static. And we need to not necessarily change it, but with something as vague as the Second Amendment, reconsider what the purpose and meaning of it really is, and not just take it at face value, which I think some people do, to try to say, hey, sorry, it says, arms, so that means arms, because obviously there's certain arms we don't allow people to carry. Grenade launchers, for example, those are arms. Those are weapons, in the same sense that some of these other weapons are very dangerous. So just something for us to consider. This is our society. We don't owe anything to people that have long since passed away. This is our society to govern and to, curve or shape the values of and shape the nature of for us and for our children and our children's children. But then once we're gone, they can change it. And that's kind of the whole point, you know. So it's just, I think there's play there. I think that within the Second Amendment as it is today, we could certainly be more careful about what weapons we allow to go around in our society. But I think it's important that we consider these factors. All right. So the next story I wanted to talk about is Congressman Matt Gaetz. A few days ago, I think it was just yesterday, or maybe the day before, he got caught up in potentially a sex scandal that involves him potentially being involved with flying a 17-year-old out of state for the purposes of sex. And if that's the case, that's a federal crime. Now, the interesting thing about this case is that it doesn't really center on him. It centers on another individual, Joel Greenberg, who is a Republican who was elected to be a tax collector in Florida, I think Seminole County in Florida. And once he got into that office, he started the deal to his friends, and there was a certain manner of corruption. And so over time, he's now resigned. He's not serving in that job anymore. But over time, you know, the feds kind of got wind of his shenanigans and started investigating him. And it started out with more money and finance-related things. But ultimately, he's now being pulled up on charges of running potentially sex trafficking operation. And as I said, he's resigned. He's actually going to go to court, go to trial as soon as maybe even this June. And so this case has been going on. A friend of his, a political associate, is Matt Gaetz. And he's admitted to being a person of interest in that investigation involving this Joel Greenberg. And the question becomes, and now it's come out, now he's talked a bit about potentially being extorted. He said that some former DOJ member tried to extort him. And that's entirely possible. But the thing about it is that doesn't really help his case, because if there was nothing to it, if it was something that was just made up and was nonsense, extortion wouldn't work. I mean, you could theoretically extort any politician and accuse them of anything, but generally they're not going to go for that. The only chance you have is if there is some meat to those bones, if there's some smoke, there's some fire behind the smoke that you're trying to do. Otherwise, you just look like a fool, and you're going to become publicly, probably, made to look bad. And they're going to ultimately just send you on your, the person is going to, if anything, look like a victim and become more popular. So that's not going to really help your case. So to me, the fact that he's bringing up the fact that this ex-DOJ employees might be trying to extort him doesn't really make me think, oh, he must be innocent of this investigation currently in the DOJ. Plus, William Barr, who is very politicized that office a great deal, okayed this investigation into both Joel Greenberg and Matt Gaetz. Because, I think it was early 2020 or maybe 2019, William Barr actually made a point of sending out a memo to all DOJ offices saying, if you're going to be investigating any federal, any politicians, you have to let me know, my office know, my central Washington office know, and then we have to sign off on it. So if there was nothing to this, if it was purely nonsense, then it wouldn't necessarily have allowed it to proceed forward. But William Barr did. So that to me also lends credence to it. But like I said with the previous article, previous story, this just came out a few days ago. So what we have to do is give it time to kind of marinate in the news and see what information comes out in the future. Because oftentimes the headline, which isn't true, that's the front page. But then the truth gets buried in section C of the back of the newspaper or in the last block of the TV news or what have you. So we have to be vigilant about not letting our first impression of a story dominate the mental narrative we have about that story. We have to be open to new facts as they come in. So he may be perfectly innocent. I think he doesn't look particularly innocent at this moment, but people usually don't right now. But we all have to have an open mind, because it may be a politician you like later on. It may be a AOC or a Ro Khanna that gets caught up in some scandal, and are we going to believe them at first? Not necessarily, but we need to give them all the chance to. We need to give the news the chance to flush out all the information, that all the facts come out before we make our own conclusion. Because the news likes to make us make early conclusions. It likes to get us upset and riled up. That's what brings in ratings. But ultimately, the truth takes time to really come out, because this guy's a guy, he needs an opportunity to really defend himself. He hasn't done such a good job so far, but he needs time. Other news networks need to vet this story and see if it bears out, see if the information they're providing makes sense. There's a whole process. The Fourth Estate only works if we give the other news agencies the opportunity to kind of check back on each other, so that we can ultimately get the answer after all said and done. So it's disappointing. Now, the other thing about this that I wanted to mention briefly, though, especially about this other individual, Joel Greenberg, is, this guy, he got elected in Florida, I think in 2018, kind of on a Trump-aligned ticket. And what worries me is that, it gets to the point with this red and blue that districts vote for these down ballot, because tax collectors are down ballot election. It's not something that people are particularly focused on, like, oh, who's going to be my tax collector for my county? But what happens is, if you don't pay attention to all of them, you get corrupt people like this guy clearly is. Now, this guy, I'm saying that because there's such overwhelming evidence. I mean, they're going to trial. There's public information about him that makes it pretty clear that what he was doing was not all on the board. So I don't know about the sex trafficking per se, but he was clearly not a guy that really should be holding the public trust. And this guy, he came there, he almost immediately started giving out contracts to his friends and started using the office for his own benefit. But he just rode in on the ticket of the party. And I think that on both sides of the aisle, red and blue, you have to be careful about, just because your party says check that box, or because you see a D or R in parentheses after his name, or some of these offices aren't even partisan. I mean, tax collector may not be officially partisan, but it doesn't mean that the offices, the political offices, don't have to or don't or can't issue recommendations for even these quote unquote nonpartisan offices. So you have to be careful about who you're voting for on those down ballots, and try to do as much of your own research as a citizen that you can. Otherwise, we'll end up with cats like these that are just there to get for themselves. All right, let's move on to the next story. All right, so not a lot's happened so far with the trial of, what's that guy's name? Derek Chauvin. I'm not pronouncing it too well, but Officer Derek Chauvin, who killed, and arguably that's what the trial is about, murdered George Floyd by putting his knee on his neck for 9.5 minutes. Not much has happened with that trial yet. We've just gotten the first couple days, but even what's come out in just a day or two, I mean, just the video itself is enough to probably get third-degree murder. But I mean, just we've seen the first few days where you had other people involved in law enforcement. Like there was someone, I think a 911 operator, or some person who was like looking at there was a camera like from the car or something that was on them and saw, and the person who was like looking at the camera like from like the home base, called their technical support and said, why is this frozen? This has been going on for too long. Like, what's going on here? And they're like, no, this isn't frozen. This is that's live action. And they actually called and said, we need to do something about it. I mean, there were several people involved in law enforcement who called at the time to report that what was going on with George Floyd was problematic. I mean, at the time, I mean, that was actually during, there's also right after. But the point is, he's getting that officer, looks like he is being, having the finger pointed at him by other people, like even in his department and that other, public officials. Isn't like the crowd versus the organization. There's people, there are other, there's other officers, there's a 911 operator, there are other people saying this doesn't look right. And so it's really hard just for these first few days to not feel like this is clearly going to be a conviction. But the thing about it is, when you're not in that court, when you don't know or don't pay attention to what the instructions to the jury are from the judge, anything can happen. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happened to OJ trial. People watched that. I mean, that was a little different. That was kind of almost like a ink blot test, But one thing I've always said to people is that I think that even in that case, regardless of the evidence, reasonable doubt was produced. And that's the thing about these trials, is you have to look at like how long they take, what the prosecutor and what the defense attorney, what they do, how they sell their case. I mean, one thing that also upset me was when I was listening to the defense attorney, it was pretty clear in his opening statement that they were going to try to put George Floyd, the victim, on trial. And you kind of hate to see that, especially the case is obvious. I mean, he's got to put on the best defense he can for his client, and that may be the only defense that he has. But it's still disappointing to see, because this is a guy that, regardless of what he did, I mean, we're not living in the future, like Judge Dredd future, where the cops are judge, jury, and executioner. I mean, to me, at a glance, it's hard to understand how in any situation that would have been justified, except for maybe, his buddy is holding a gun to the cop's head, and if the cop moves off his neck, he's going to get shot, or some ridiculous movie scenario like that. Any realistic scenario involving just one cop and one perpetrator, how do you do that for 9.5 minutes and it'd be okay? So, I try to almost not look too much at it because I don't want to get too emotionally invested, because, at my age, I've seen plenty of trials that seemed obvious, seemed like, a person should be held into account, and it doesn't go that way. And so I watch this case and I see this information, and it already looks like, why are we taking a month and a half for this? I mean, I don't understand what the necessity is. I mean, how many angles do we have to show this from? How many people have to get up there and say they watched him die while this officer was on his neck? What does it take? I don't know. So it's kind of here. I'm not going to not talk about it because it's in the news and it's what people are talking about. But it just seems like it's besides them just harping on the fact that he had drugs in his system, which sure he had, but that doesn't mean you deserve to die. And I mean, oftentimes, sometimes with these kind of cases involving police-related deaths, the person who does the autopsy will kind of say it's undetermined, or we're not sure how the person died, and they'll play with that and to kind of protect the police officer. But in this case, the coroner or either coroner or the person who did the autopsy, they have different names in different counties. Whoever that was said, "Oh no, this person, they died because they ran out of breath. It was an obstruction. They made it clear the officer's knee being on his neck is what caused him to die." So that being the case, it's hard to understand what they're how you get a not guilty. I think, in my opinion, just at a glance, I would guess at best case, he gets 3rd-degree murder, which is kind of the one where the 2nd degree is already not premeditated. It's already kind of, it happened, it's too bad. 3rd degree is more so it's almost accidental. I think I'm sure literally accidental, but it's a lower requirement. And so I think that's probably the best case. That may be what the defense attorney's angling for. But that opening statement, it seemed like they were aiming for the moon and trying to say, no, it's actually the autopsy is wrong. All the people they saw, it's wrong. This guy's innocent. That's probably the wrong strategy. You probably want to go for the angles rather than the slam dunk. But we'll see what happens. Like a month, 2 months for this thing to go through apparently, based on what I've heard from the news, it's going to be a few months before we know what happens with this. So that's that case. So another thing I just saw, I think it was today, was Senator Ted Cruz was cruising through the facility for where they're detaining kids that show up at the border, I think in general, without any parents accompanying them. And of course, the Biden administration has this problem of they don't have that many facilities to house all these kids. I heard they actually try to fly them up to different parts of the country just to try to make the situation, make the environment better, so they're not all packed in right at these spots at the southern border. He comes in there and he starts trying to take a recording of it, and a woman gets in front of him and tries to say, "Don't do it, stop this, or give them dignity." And he's like, "Well, how is this dignified with what's going on with them?" And acting all indignant about what's happening with these kids. Well, this has been going on for years. And AOC, in a tweet at Ted Cruz, said, "Well, this is going on for years, and you didn't seem to care about it when President Trump's administration was doing this. So you're caring about it now seems disingenuous. To put it simply." And so my feeling about that is that you have to give the Biden administration time to figure out what to do about this. But my question to people like Senator Ted Cruz or any Republicans that now want to throw shade at President Biden and his administration for having kids in less than ideal housing situations, especially during a pandemic, which Cruz also pointed out, is, well, why don't you put a law forward to spend some money to open up more facilities and create more bandwidth for President Biden to work with? Because he can't allocate money that's not for this to it. He can try to work around the edges and move money within INS or within the Department of Homeland Security to try to create funds. But you could go out and write a bill and say, "Hey, we need to do something about this. Let's spend some taxpayer money to, since this is un-American, what's going on here, let's put our money where our mouth is and actually do something about this. We'll see if any kind of legislation like that occurs. I think it's more likely they just try to shame them for naked political points, but then leave it as it is. And to me, that doesn't demonstrate any real caring about the issue, because to me, our federal budget and how we spend our money represents our values. It represents what we're willing as a society to spend money on, represents where our focus and our interest and our concern is. So like it's concerning to me how much money we spend on our military and on our presence in foreign countries, as I don't think that should be our society's focus. Not that we need to not look at that at all, but in terms of looking at how much money is spent, more than any other country in the world, it's hard not to make us look like building empire is our focus as a country. And so coming back to this issue, if this is important to Senator Cruz and other Republicans, then let's pass some more funds and create some space for these kids so that we can treat them more humanely, and especially during this pandemic, keep the pandemic from spreading from within these facilities. I think that's perfectly reasonable and rational, and that would get bipartisan support. But I don't think it's going to happen. Call me cynical. Anyway, so as far as Biden, I'm going to give him a few months. It's only been like 60-something days into his administration. This is a big problem. It's one he inherited. He should have time to look at it and try to figure out how to improve it. I think that we need to keep on him, though. I think that it shouldn't be hidden. I don't think that the Democrats who are talking about this issue before the election should suddenly be quiet. I think that's politics, too. They should keep on talking about this. They should offer bills to try to address this matter as well. But that's all that red gang, blue gang stuff. It works on the other side too. And some of those Democrats who are talking big about this issues with these kids at the border and the kids in cages are now being quiet. And that's a form of hypocrisy as well. All right, here's an interesting one. Biden's infrastructure plan. So a few days ago, President Biden announced that I don't think he specifically said it was going to be the reconciliation bill, although I think that's likely what it'd have to be. But he wants to have a big infrastructure bill costing $2 to $3 trillion. Now, the first thing I want to say about that is, it seems like a bit small. And once I break into the details, you'll see it's even smaller than it sounds like. There was a study I meant to look up where it was from that suggested to minimally bring our infrastructure up to like snuff, like up to a level that's reasonable for a first world country or a rich country like ours. It's $4 to $5 trillion. Other people, Bernie Sanders suggested closer to 10 trillion or more than that. So 2 to 3 trillion really isn't that impressive. What's interesting is that Biden actually wants to try to make this as budget neutral as possible. So whereas the last COVID bill just pretty much spent money, we're just going to put out more debt, more T-bills, what have you, generate more debt in order to spend it. Biden actually wants to raise corporate taxes in order to try to pay for this particular infrastructure plan, which I think is perfectly reasonable. But what it also means is that you really can go bigger than this. If you're willing to raise $1 to $2 trillion, then you could spend 3 to 4 to 5, and it's not that unreasonable. So, but I think that is an important point to note that he is willing to raise taxes or to put money into this. But to me, that gives you more space to be more ambitious. Now, the main components of it are, as they were announced so far, these things are always changing, negotiation, what have you. But this is some of the initial numbers that I've seen. $650 billion to rebuild U.S. infrastructure. That sounds like everything, but it's not. $400 billion to care for the elderly and disabled. That's kind of vague. I guess that's related to infrastructure, but that seems like something different, like a gigantic earmark. But I'm assuming it's related to infrastructure somehow. $300 billion for housing infrastructure, and then $300 billion to revive manufacturing in this country. Now, on that last one, there's arguments that we shouldn't really be trying necessarily to bring back manufacturing here, that's not something that we should be trying to move forward and get more progressive into new industries instead of trying to go back and resurrect ones that have been offshored because it's more efficient to do it that way. So that may be kind of backward looking. But the other thing about those numbers is they don't add up to over $2 trillion. So I'm kind of wondering what the other stuff is, the low level items that are also kind of going to be in there. So I think we'll see, again, this is new news. So we got to give it a little bit of time, see what additional information comes out. Maybe we'll have a better idea in a week or two, where this is really going to be. One thing also that some progressive commentators, not necessarily officials per se. They're actually kind of quiet about this right now. So I think if anything, they're saying should spend more in general. But what people are saying is that we should look at, considering aspects of the Green New Deal of investing in new renewable technologies and centering our expenditures on building infrastructure into things that are forward-looking rather than rebuilding older infrastructure. Again, this plan is very new. It's a lot of new ideas. It's not something that's been going on for a long time in terms of the news about it. So we have to give it time and see what the details are. But I'd hate to see like a whole bunch of it going to resurrecting coal or something like that. Like we need to look at what the future holds for this country for the next 50 to 100 years. And that's honestly not coal, for example. So that's the thing. Now, here's the other thing about it. So we've got this infrastructure bill, and ostensibly part of it is trying to bring more jobs back to this country to deal with some of the unemployment, some of the offshoring. That's what it sounds like it's doing. Well, thematically, it sure seems like a good place to put in a raise to the minimum wage, right? And speaking on that, Chuck Schumer now is talking about sliding into the Senate bill the $15 minimum wage increase and trying to get a vote on that again. Now, pessimists say, well, we had a vote on it. 8 senators voted no on it. So, why would that work this time when it didn't work last time? But Chuck Schumer, who has an election coming up in 2022, is a little worried about AOC and maybe other progressive challengers. Seems like he really wants to push this because it's an egg on his face if he does this and just gets shot down again. It makes him look dumb and ineffectual. So it's hard to believe that he's really going to try to do this and not have some plan as to what to do. Now, the first thing is 2 of those votes, of those 8 votes, 2 of those votes were politicians from Delaware, one of whom is Joe Biden's close friend. So if Schumer can get Chuck Biden on board with this, those 2 votes come right back. Some of the other ones I think are regular kind of blue gang Senate Democrats who, if the tide's going the way the tide's going with the president, with the leadership, they'll probably go along. The big question is going to be Sinema. It's going to be Manchin. And Sinema, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later in more detail, as interestingly enough, all her kind of progressive talk when she was a younger politician, didn't much talk about raising the minimum wage. Hers is much more cultural progressivism rather than economic. So they may be hard gets. But the other thing about this is an opportunity for progressives in the House to assert themselves, especially if Schumer's an ally in the Senate, and draw a line in the sand and say, well, look, the COVID bill was an emergency. It was a situation where we had to do it quickly to get people immunized, to deal with issues of people being able to not get kicked out of their homes, all this kind of stuff that was right now. Infrastructure, while important, isn't a timeliness issue. There's time for them to draw a line in the sand and say, we need the minimum wage in this bill. And if we don't get it, Joe Biden, you're not getting your infrastructure bill that you want very much. That's how you use power and leverage. If there's only a less than 10-seat majority in the House, you can find 7 or 8 progressives that want this. The question is, are 1 or 2 going to be leaders and actually call to the other ones and say, we're going to do this. Are you with me? That's what this takes in the House is leadership, progressive leadership, to fight for these, because plenty of people will say, oh, I'd love to have this. I'd love to have that. But who's going to actually make a stink? Because Bernie at times in the Senate has been willing to make a stink. And indeed, that last vote, you saw some of the acting out by some of the senators like Sinema was in part because they were kind of a rebuke of what Bernie was doing. But this time around, if Schumer's on there and he's putting that in the Senate and the House is saying, hey, this bill is nowhere, then you put Biden in the situation of having to look at those senators in the Senate and saying, hey, I'm your president, calling on the blue gang to stand up for him. And if he does that, then maybe you change the calculus. But I think it takes more than Chuck Schumer. I think it takes those congressional progressives like AOC, like Jayapal, like Cori Bush and Bowman. Takes them standing up and saying this bill, which I think will have to be reconciliation because Republicans aren't going to play ball. It's going to be reconciliation. This reconciliation bill isn't going anywhere without the thing that you, President Joe Biden, promised when you were running for election. Put it in here, even if the parliamentarian who Schumer's still trying to talk around and say, oh, well, maybe the parliamentarian will go a different way because it's infrastructure, it's a little bit different. Just tell Biden, I don't care about the parliamentarian. It's up to you, because it is. The parliamentarian has no power. Kamala Harris, who is Joe Biden's right hand, It's up to her. So Joe Biden tells her, and Joe Biden tells the Delaware congregation, and Joe Biden goes to West Virginia, goes to Arizona, and says, this is what I want to do. This is my leadership. This is where I'm putting my foot and saying, we're doing this. Do I think the Democratic caucus at large rebukes him on something that's 65, 70% popularity? Doesn't really make sense. This could happen. It's like Medicare for all, which I think some Democrats are ideologically opposed to. This is something that we have that is part of the legacy of progressive politics and liberal politics over the last 50 years. What's the problem? So I'm a little more bullish, but a lot of it's going to happen behind the scenes, and we'll never know what exactly was said between who. Ooh, I already did this one. I did this one off the top of my head. I had a whole different segment for the minimum wage, but yeah. Oh, that was the last thing I wanted to talk about, was just we should actually, if this goes along, this infrastructure bill, and all the progressives sign up for it and nobody makes any noise about the minimum wage in the House, they should be shamed for it. I did a video a while back because some of the progressives online were calling progressives in the House frauds and saying, if you're not willing to force a vote and make Pelosi issue a vote on the Medicare for all, then you're frauds because you're voting for this, this corporate Democrat, and you're not demanding anything for it. I thought it was a bad idea because I didn't think Medicare for all could pass with the current Congress. However, a few weeks later, I made another video saying, maybe he had a point, because when this minimum wage came up with the COVID bill, there was nary a peep of a potential line being drawn of them really standing up for it. There was a letter that Ro Khanna sent to Biden with like 23 signatures on it. That's a letter. I mean, this isn't a Saturday Night Live skit where letters change people's minds. This is real life. Power gives up nothing without a demand. And progressives weren't willing to demand even a minimum wage increase for their vote when it came to the COVID relief bill. So here we are. We've got another reconciliation package, most likely. And will progressives draw a line this time? Will they actually stand with a senator or senators who are trying to draw that same line in the Senate and actually put on a united front and make this demand of the president? FDR, for as much as we hold him up, he had to be pushed a little bit too. There were outside forces that pushed him as much left as he went. People don't remember that. They just remember the president. But that's the thing about Biden is I think a lot of this plays into his ego. And if he feels like he's going to miss out on a presidency that he thinks could be great because of a few small things, maybe he'll put in the effort to actually move the ball on this. We'll have to wait and see, but I think it's going to take pressure. Otherwise, it's easiest to just do what everybody easily agrees with. It's harder to make demands and to make asks of people. We in our personal lives, it's the same thing. It's harder to make the ask. It's easier to just go along and get along, both in Congress and in real life. So we'll have to see, how that goes. All right. So my next story, I jump really fast. My next story, I want to talk about actually something a little bit different. So I started this channel in part because I wanted to get people, involved in politics. And looks like I talked about that last one a little too long and somebody left. Oh, well. So I want to get people get involved in politics. And one of the things that anybody can do is lobby Congress. It's not something that only rich people do or only connected people can do. Congress is there. They've got public phone numbers. There are plenty of organizations that are behind certain issues, that do research, that prep themselves, that are prepared, and are looking for people that are willing to go as constituents or even as non-constituents, but are willing to actually go and make those calls, get those meetings, and inform politicians about certain issues. You would be surprised how little some politicians know about important issues. And for example, I take something that happened to me just a few days ago. So I'm not going to say names because that's not good. And I will say the organization I was lobbying on behalf of is Move to Amend. That's a grassroots organization that wants to say that corporations aren't persons under the 14th Amendment with constitutional rights, and that money is in speech and shall be regulated by Congress for the purpose of campaign finance reform. It's beautiful. So that's the amendment. And we had 75 co-sponsors last time. We're trying to get to 100. We're over 50 already just in 2 months. It hasn't even been introduced yet. We're already over 50. So we're doing great. I had a politician in the Southern California area, I'll say that I think wasn't particularly familiar with the issue and I hadn't talked to before in previous sessions. So I reached out to this congressperson. I got some constituents. We did some mailers. I got a few constituents that were willing to come with me to the meeting because I'm not in that person's district. So it's not Judy Chu because that's in my district and she's already a signee. And I got the constituents. We go in, set up the Zoom meeting. I put in the request on the website. I do follow-up emails. I get the meeting with the congressional staffer. So I start talking to him. The congressional staffer expresses that this politician does want to get money out of politics. He's signed on to some other stuff. I try to explain how that stuff isn't sufficient to the task. The big issue, the big fighting point is the issue of corporate constitutional rights. You see, corporations are artificial persons, and what that means is they are considered to be an artificial person for the purpose of standing in court. But what happened is corporations took that standing and used it to apply and go as far as to the Supreme Court to try to get constitutional rights, to try to get constitutional protections as persons under the 14th Amendment, which does not specify artificial or not. It just says persons. However, there are other aspects of it that make it clear that you're talking about human beings. I mean, it was passed in order to give the federal government the ability to protect all Americans from states that don't respect our civil rights, especially Black people and brown people. So that's the context in which the 14th Amendment was passed. It wasn't passed to protect corporations. Anyway, so that's the initial tipping point. And then that decision gets used to grant corporations, Fourth Amendment rights, the protections against illegal search and seizure, which you say, well, don't they need that protection? Well, they could have statutory protections against that based in law, just like corporations are based in law. They don't need constitutional protections as if they're a human being that lives and dies and has possessions the same way a person does. They're corporations. They're created by statute, by laws that we write, and they should be governed by those laws, not by the Constitution, which is written as a system of principles about how human beings shall be treated by the government. So that's where the disconnect is. And discussing with this staffer, they seem to conflate the 14th Amendment protections, which then lead to other protections. Once you're a federal person, you have the right to free speech and theoretically bearing arms, although no court's given a corporation the right to bear arms as far as I know, but some of the other rights, right to a jury trial, corporations I think have that now. So there's these other rights that came out of that initial 14th Amendment granting by the Supreme Court. So we want to take that back and say corporations are still artificial persons. And that's what I'm trying to make clear to him. They're still standing in court to be sued, but they can't come back and say, I have the right to a jury trial or because of the Constitution, or you can't do an emergency examination of our facility to see if we're dumping chemicals because of, I think that's either the Fourth or the Fifth Amendment, or Fourth or Sixth Amendment. So you can't do that kind of stuff. That's what we're trying to say they can't do anymore. They can't go to the Constitution for as a special safety valve or as an emergency, because corporations, what they do is they have plenty of lawyers, and when they sue, they'll throw the entire kitchen sink at any issue. They'll try all kinds of different angles. There's no penalty in the law for making a ridiculous assumption, that's a ridiculous assertion that's clearly not true. You can make all the assertions you want, no downside to it. So at some point, so that's what happened in the late 1800s or 19th century is they're just saying we're persons. They tried a few times before they got to court to issue a summary that said that they granted those protections, even though the decision didn't. The summary said that the court considered corporations persons, and that's where the ball started rolling. The corporations started using that, and it was just on like that. And a whole lot of stuff happened during the era of the 20s when corporations get really powerful, a lot of robber barons. That's when you saw a lot of Supreme Court decisions that favored corporations. And then again, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, once the Supreme Court turned conservative again. So you see at certain times and certain eras where they started using it. But the thing about the Supreme Court is, and this is a more general issue, is Supreme Court sometimes likes to act like it's this great arbiter of legal truth. But a lot of times the jurists in it act very hacky. And they just try to they start with a conclusion that they want, and they draw their way to it however they want to. And that's how I think this really got created, was them doing what they had to do to give the decision that they wanted to give. Unfortunately, it had side effects that maybe they didn't even anticipate. So anyway, that's what we're about. So we had that discussion. There was definitely pushback from the staffer of this congressperson, but it was still a good meeting. And I think that this is a congressperson that we may be able to, over time, work on and perhaps be able to convince to sign on to. It'll be HJR 48, the We the People Act. It's not offered yet because there haven't been 47 House joint resolutions already. We're the 48th. It can't come up until there's 47. Pramila Jayapal, who's our lead sponsor, who who I still criticize here, but she is really smart and I do like her, but she still needs to show more leadership on the minimum wage, I think. But she's a lead sponsor. She's got her holding, the bill is holding its spot for the 48th once it gets there. Then you just call her up and say, okay, you still doing it? Yes. It'll come up there, and then boom, 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 we'll immediately have a whole bunch of co-sponsors. So it's going well, but the whole point of this me telling you all this is that we can all get involved. Maybe not with Move to Amend, the organizations that support Medicare for All, and there are people that need to go and find constituents and make phone calls and make meetings and talk to these people about Medicare for All, Green New Deal. There's all these issues, minimum wage. There's all these issues with organizations. You can say you can affiliate yourself with an organization, which helps, and then say, I'm on their behalf. We've got some constituents. We'd like to talk to you. And they'll say, okay. And because most of these offices, especially, honestly, I hate to say sound partisan, but especially the Democratic offices. The Republican offices, well, if you have a constituent, you got a chance, but they can be dismissive at times, in my limited experience and what I've heard from people. Democratic ones tend to be, although they can be dismissive too. And I had a really bad meeting with a chief of staff of a Democratic congressperson once, and I mean, they were just mean. I was blown away. It was the worst meeting I'd ever had. But they tend to be better. But the point is, they're there for you, especially district offices. If you're having a hard time with the Washington office, the district office is there for you. They're there to listen to you, for you to get constituents to go there to tell them your concerns, get to know you. Some of the constituents I've worked with, the staffer knew who they were. Because the person that called them up themselves to talk to them. But that's what they're there for. And at least some Congress people still believe in that whole representing the people thing. But if we don't tell them, they'll just go along to get along. We have to make our voices known. And that's what citizenship and what democracy is about, what it needs to be about for it to have any chance of working. So hope you appreciated that story. Let's see here. Got a few more. That one. Okay. So I don't think, let me know if I'm wrong, but I don't think my viewer from Oklahoma is on right now. I haven't seen any comments in the stream. If you're here, I have a little profile of one of the Oklahoma senators, but I kind of want to hold it for when that person is actually able to be in my stream. So if you're here, I'll go ahead and do it. Otherwise, I think I'll probably just talk about Kyrsten Sinema and probably wrap it up after that if there's not any questions. So as you know, yeah, I try to cool it down in here, but it's still really hot with these lights, man. I need to figure out like how cool to make it so that I don't start sweating like this, because that's when it gets uncomfortable when I start sweating. Anyway, so a few weeks ago, this senator named Kyrsten Sinema decided to make a little statement with her down vote on the minimum wage. And I didn't really know much about her, so I kind of made it a point to read a little bit about her background. There's a great article I read about her background and kind of understanding where did she come from. So it's an interesting story. So she started off as kind of an anti-war activist involved with the Green Party. She protested the Iraq and I believe the Afghanistan war too, back in the early aughts. And then she got kind of initially involved in Congress, initially involved in her state house, in the state house in Arizona. So she's from Arizona. So she was in Arizona and she was involved in the state house, in the state house politics and being a representative there. And I think she eventually went from the state house, the lower chamber, to the upper chamber in the state house. But while she was there, it was primarily a Republican dominated legislature in Arizona. And so while she's there, one of the things that kind of became part of her brand was bipartisanship. And she started making that part of her kind of brand. She also, as I pointed out earlier in the video, her focus generally tended to be on cultural progressivism, issues like LGBTQ issues, things like more of that nature, rather than say economic progressivism. She wasn't totally silent on that, but that tended to be where her focus was. Now, you might anti-war, you could interpret that either way. That's kind of a third angle. That's more so kind of internationalism, something like that. But in that, I guess she seemed pretty progressive on. But economic, not particularly. But over time, what you started to see with her as she kind of progressed up the House, and then she ran for the House, the Congress, and she got into the lower house, become an Arizona representative or federal Congress. And now she's a senator. But over that time, bipartisanship became more and more part of her brand. The kind of lefty politics started more and more disappearing. And she seems to be doing a lot more triangulating in order to stay right in the middle. The funny thing is, though, she may have triangulated wrong in this case. The $15 minimum wage in Arizona is actually fairly popular, even on a bipartisan basis in terms of polling. And so what Chuck Schumer is doing, for example, he may be working to, Chuck Schumer may be able to get someone like her to change her mind and not continue to vote that way. Oh, her polling numbers after that vote took a big dive in Arizona. And what I'm saying is, she strikes me, based on reading her history, as someone who is trying to read the tea leaves of electoralism. She's not going to lead and kind of say, I stand for this, come follow me, which is kind of leadership you sometimes hope that representatives do. They kind of say who they are, but they run on something. They run on issues. They run on things that they will fight for. And then when they get there, they fight for them. She more so ran on, I'm a moderate, reasonable person who wants to work with Republicans. Why don't you vote for me? But then once they get there, they don't necessarily really stand for anything, because they're there with a brand of how they do their job rather than what they fight for. So with these polling numbers going down the way they are, there may actually be a chance that the person that last time voted down the minimum wage with a fancy little dip and a thumbs down could end up voting the other way if it's going to pass. Like, I don't think, she may not be willing to be that one vote. Like, if they get Manchin, who she looks up to, which is again interesting because Manchin is very culturally conservative, which again, her transformation from being very culturally left to now kind of not idolizing, but looking up to as the ideal senator. Joe Manchin is very culturally conservative as well as economically conservative. Unnecessarily, because West Virginia is actually fairly economically progressive. It's just culturally conservative, which is part of the reason why he's able to win there. But in these situations with minimum wage, you have to be careful that you don't abandon those economic progressives that are part of your coalition. So both of them have to worry about that. So our point with Sinema, though, is she sees those polling numbers. She's there to try to survive, to stay in Congress, to maybe even try to run for president. There is a fair amount of ambition in her background in terms of the way she kind of stays in one job for one term, maybe two, and then goes to the next one. That's an ambition. There's a sense of ambition there that we may need to worry about. Okay, is Kyrsten Sinema really going to be the person to stand in the way of something that popular? And the answer is probably no. So it may be some of the other senators like Manchin that you may have to convince. But she may go along once those Delaware voters change their mind. If you can get Manchin to change his mind, I doubt she's going to be that one vote that prevents the minimum wage, because her district in Arizona is actually, if I remember correctly, fairly progressive. I think some of her groups or districts she's represented have been less progressive in the past, but the one she's in now is actually a fairly safe Democratic seat. And there's no real reason for her to be against the minimum wage unless she's philosophically against it, or maybe she takes money from somebody and doesn't want to do it because they're telling her to. Or I don't think that happens a lot. I think money selects people before they get to Congress. That's the way I think corruption primarily works. There are people that do take money. Don't get me wrong. There are people who may get rich being in Congress, but a lot of them, they get customized. They get made into the congressperson they are by the people that give them money to get there when they really need it, before they get to the point where they have power. And then, well, they're the person they are. They've been selected. They've been patterned or shaped into that person by the time they get there. And the ones that be too progressive, that want minimum wage, don't get the money from the donors in the first place. So Kyrsten Sinema's an interesting character. She's one of the ones that would generally have called herself a progressive 10 years ago, but doesn't now. And she's one of the ones standing in the way of the minimum wage. We'll have to see if she really is willing to stand in its way, if she's the one vote holding it back. So that's that. Now, we've got 2 people in the stream right now. I got up to 4, but I guess I talked about Kyrsten Sinema too long. So we got 2 left. If you want to say hello, have a question for me, or want to ask me something, or if you're one of you are the cat from Oklahoma that comes to my stream sometimes, I actually have a profile of one of your senators I could discuss. Otherwise, I think I'm about finished with this. Next week, I'm probably going to prep another Oklahoma senator profile. I'm going to hold this one, I think, for this week because I don't think he's here today. But I want to thank everybody for who's on the stream, for being on the stream. I want to know, one thing I'm going to check is, I'm curious. I want to check to see if I can figure out who actually is on the stream, because I have the StreamYard up right now. So I'm going to do some testing here. If you want to go, you can. I want to see if I can see. I see notifications. I see 9 notifications in here. I clicked on something. Nothing's happening. Interesting. So I clicked on that. Share. You can reach up to the net. Nothing. That's nothing. That's not helping me. That's not helping me. Let me see. That's not doing anything. Let's see. So I could go in. Can I go in here? Can I see? Let me. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna try to do this. I'm trying to view live in control room. Let's see if that works. Oh, that's interesting. I'm gonna try to view live in control room. Let's see if that blows the whole stream up. Let's see here. Welcome to the new. When do you want to go live? Later. Okay, back. Why does it? All right, so that's doing that. I wonder if I just killed YouTube. I don't know if I killed YouTube when I did this. Right now, if you just joined, I'm just trying to see if I can see who the people are in the stream through YouTube. I'm trying to check the studio. See, I'm clicking out, trying to check the studio. Connection's excellent. Okay, so I can see that the 2 live viewers. They're both on YouTube. So I got one. I guess I have one from Facebook. Hey, thanks for joining me. Say hello if you got any questions, want to ask anything about politics or anything. I'm here now. I'm open to it. Right now, I'm just playing with I've only streamed a few times, so trying to learn all the software. And I'm trying to see if I can see anything else about it. It doesn't seem like I can actually click on and see anything else about this. I was trying to see if I could. Oops. Nope. I can't seem to see it. Let me click back here. Nope, no messages. Okay. Yeah, I can't seem to see it. So I think only way I can see people in here is if they actually post comments. Otherwise, I can't tell it here. So, well, that is what it is. So, at the end of my stream, I talked about, let me see. So I talked about, that's random. Okay. So I talked about George Floyd a little bit. I talked about the mass shooting in California today. I talked about Biden's infrastructure plan and what it looks like so far, and the fact that it's probably going to be done through reconciliation. I talked about how we probably should be trying to get the minimum wage into that bill because it's not the same kind of timeliness that the COVID bill had. And I think adding the minimum wage to that infrastructure bill makes sense. If we're trying to create new jobs, they should be good, well-paying jobs. So thematically, it fits well within the whole idea of the infrastructure bill. And I think that if congressional Democrats on both the House and the Senate put that demand on Biden and on his administration to fight for the minimum wage, then they will. And I think that all they have to do is put some effort into that push, and you'll actually see the senators that might be holding out fall in line. Because really, it's only about 4 senators. The Delaware ones will do whatever Biden says. Manchin, I think, is definitely on board for 12 or 13. I think just 15 might have balked at that. So that's negotiation. You might be able to get 12 or 13. And then Sinema, as I said, I talked about her a little bit and her progressive kind of roots and how she's shifting to being more of a brand and being bipartisan now that she's a senator. So she fights for the filibuster. She fights for finding bills that Republicans are willing to sign on to, which is almost nothing. But she wants to survive. And I think she doesn't want to risk, she's not willing to risk her seat to sign on to another, reconciliation bill with no Republicans. That's very popular. So I think that's the move for her. So I don't think there's that much real barrier if there's just a will on the part of Senate and House progressives to make that demand. Excuse me, to make that demand. I don't know how people who stream for hours never burp. I never see someone burp on a stream, but I don't know how people don't do that. Like, to me, it's something it's a human thing. I haven't eaten or drank anything in like an hour and change, and it still do it. Anyway, so I talked a lot about that. So you can see the replay on Facebook or on YouTube, and I'm going to add chapters to it on YouTube. Can't really do that on Facebook as far as I know. So you can go back and watch the whole thing if you want to. But thanks everybody for coming in here and for checking me out. I have a YouTube channel, I have a Twitter, which I announce all my new videos, at least one video a week, separate from streaming. Streaming is something I'm doing to practice being natural on camera. Obviously, I'm not, but you don't get better at anything without putting some effort into it. So I'm practicing, streaming, and not saying too much, but that's how that goes. So I'm on Twitter. I post every week. It's my Twitter handle over here. That's my Twitter handle. Then I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. I also post my new videos too. And also, of course, the YouTube channel itself. Please subscribe. I produce videos every week. When we're in election season, I usually do videos about propositions and about various bills and direct democracy legislation. So consider that as well. And thanks for watching the stream for 10 Minutes for Democracy for April 1st, 2021.